He was dragged from the witness stand in handcuffs. Not for lying, but for quoting the Constitution better than the judge. The courtroom laughed until the footage leaked. Now the nation wants answers, and one man's past could burn the whole system down. But what they found in his sealed juvenile file, no one was ready for that. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Montgomery County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and entitlement. From its cold marble pillars to the polished brass of the judge's bench, every corner echoed authority, except the corners Leonard Hayes had scrubbed. For 15 years, he had worked quietly, unseen, often stepping aside when men in suits brushed past without so much as a nod. That morning, he stood at the witness stand, uninvited by the elite, unwelcomed by the powerful, but still he stood. Leonard wore his best shirt, which meant the collar stayed flat until it reached the fray on his right shoulder. His slacks had been pressed between two encyclopedias the night before, but it was his shoes worn split at the soles, polished with cooking oil, that drew the courtroom's gaze. Whispers trickled across the gallery, soft enough to sound like rain, sharp enough to sting. From the elevated bench, Judge Denton Caldwell didn't bother hiding his smirk. "Mr. Hayes," he began, leaning back with the confidence of a man born immune to accountability. "I assume you're not here to clean the floors." Snickers danced through the gallery. A white bailiff near the jury box covered his mouth but didn't hide his shoulders shaking. Leonard didn't flinch. He placed a trembling hand on the wooden rail in front of him. The courthouse had changed little in 15 years. He remembered buffing the very floor he now stood above. He had once wiped vomit from that jury box during a DUI trial. That memory returned now, oddly empowering. He wasn't afraid of this space. Not the wood, not the whispers, not even the robe. The plaintiff's attorney, a young, overworked public defender named Riley Gant, stood and nodded toward Leonard. "Your Honor, Mr. Hayes is a material witness to the circumstances of Miss Tasha Reynolds' eviction. He's willing to testify about what he saw." Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "I see. A janitor and now a legal witness." "Yes, sir," Leonard answered quietly. "I was there when—" "Son," the judge interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "This ain't a janitor's union meeting." The court laughed again, louder this time. It was the kind of laughter that didn't need volume to cut. It used tone and timing like a razor. Leonard stared straight ahead. It was the way Caldwell had said son, not like a term of endearment, like ownership, like he still believed black men in that room should speak only when spoken to. Riley stood again. "Objection to the court's tone, Your Honor." "Overruled," Caldwell snapped. Leonard shifted slightly, his fingers brushing against something in his coat. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook. The edges curled. The cover bore faded initials. B.H. His father's. Inside were passages written in dense cursive. His father had filled its pages during long nights. Leonard could barely remember. It had survived floods, house moves, and time, but Leonard had never used it for show. Today he wasn't performing. Today he had come prepared. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said with a sneer, "perhaps you'd like to recite something next. The Gettysburg Address, maybe?" Leonard opened the notebook slowly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He spoke deliberately. "We the people of the United States," he began, "in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility." The courtroom went still. Caldwell blinked once. Twice. Leonard didn't pause. "Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." The court stenographer hesitated, unsure whether to transcribe. Leonard continued, "To ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." He looked directly at Caldwell then. His voice was even, but his eyes carried weight, generations of it. Not anger. Something older, something firmer, like granite under pressure. "I was there, Your Honor," Leonard added softly. "Not as a janitor, as a witness. I watched officers throw my niece's baby crib onto the sidewalk. I saw them laugh when she cried. I saw them lie, and I remember every detail." Mouths were no longer smiling. A sharp rustle from the press bench. Someone had started recording. Caldwell straightened. "Mr. Hayes, you are not here to grandstand." "No, sir," Leonard replied. "I'm here to testify. Like the Constitution says I have the right to." From the back of the courtroom, an older black woman whispered, "Praise be." Riley, stunned, sat slowly. Even the bailiff had stopped smirking. Leonard looked down at his shoes. Still broken, still oil-polished. But suddenly they felt like armor. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat. "We'll take a 10-minute recess." He banged the gavel harder than needed. The sound echoed too long, too loud. Leonard stood there a moment longer, eyes never leaving the bench. The courtroom emptied in murmurs. Outside, phones buzzed with fresh footage. And back in the empty stillness of the chamber, Leonard slowly closed the notebook, its cracked spine creaking like a page turning in history. Judge Caldwell stared at the closed door long after Leonard left the stand. His smirk gone, his face pale as if the words he'd heard weren't just echoes, but a warning. The courtroom door clicked shut behind Leonard Hayes, but the silence inside still vibrated with the aftershock of his words. The judge's face, once a gallery of smug assurance, had turned unreadable. Outside, the media huddled, hungry. Inside, justice blinked, caught off guard by a man it had stepped over for decades. But Leonard's poise at that witness stand didn't come from nowhere. 15 years earlier, in a crumbling one-bedroom apartment off Jefferson Street, Leonard sat hunched over a library copy of Blackstone's Commentaries, the light above him flickering like a nervous heartbeat. The smell of pine sol clung to his fingers. He hadn't even changed out of his janitor uniform. He didn't care. The shift was over, but the real work was just beginning. Every night after mopping vomit from courtroom aisles and scrubbing the underside of benches that justice forgot, Leonard studied law with the fury of a man chasing salvation. His brother, Malcolm Hayes, had been 22 when he was locked away. A minor possession charge spiraled into a 10-year sentence, and though the system called it justice, Leonard knew what it really was: a punishment not for crime, but for color, for zip code, for daring to walk home in a hoodie with no ID and no explanation. Malcolm had begged Leonard not to go to court that day, but Leonard had gone anyway. He watched the trial in silence. He remembered the judge yawning. He remembered the prosecutor making jokes during recess. He remembered the cuffs. That memory became his fire. At 2 a.m., Leonard stood in courtroom aisles with a mop in hand, reciting phrases aloud. "Your Honor, may I present Exhibit A into evidence? Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant and prejudicial. As defined under Article 6, Clause 2, the Supremacy Clause, federal law shall be the supreme law of the land." He mimicked lawyers. He mimicked tone, cadence, posture. He cleaned with one hand and highlighted with the other. He became fluent in a language that had failed his brother. The mop was no longer just a tool for cleanliness. It was his weight, his test, and eventually, his weapon. When courtrooms emptied and lights dimmed, Leonard stood in the silence where power had just spoken and dared to believe he could one day speak back. And now, in the present, he was. The moment Judge Caldwell recessed the court, Leonard remained still. The courtroom didn't return to noise. It simply watched a janitor, a man without letters behind his name or silk around his neck, recite precedents and protections with the calm authority of someone who understood them, not just on paper but in bone. "Did you hear him quote Brown v. Board?" one woman whispered. "Word for word." "Who taught him that?" asked a local reporter, scribbling frantically. "Who is this guy?" The answer was simple. No one taught Leonard Hayes. He taught himself. Every statute, every footnote, every case he remembered was hard-earned, not in lecture halls, but in late-night laundromats, with $1 coffee and second-hand textbooks. He had no diploma, but he had clarity, and clarity cuts deeper than any certificate. Back at the courthouse cafeteria, now mostly empty, Leonard sat at a corner table, untouched sandwich beside him. His niece, Tasha Reynolds, joined him slowly, eyes red from crying. "They laughed at you," she said, voice trembling. "Why didn't you walk out?" Leonard looked at her, then at his calloused hands. "Because they've been laughing since I was born," he said. "I'm just tired of pretending not to hear it." Tasha blinked, stunned by the calm with which he carried rage. It wasn't performative. It wasn't loud. But it was there, steady, sharpened over years. Riley Gant, the young public defender, rushed in, nearly breathless. "Mr. Hayes, Leonard, I don't know what law school you went to, but that was masterclass." "I didn't," Leonard replied simply. "But I read enough to know that my niece's rights were trampled." Riley sat stunned. Do you have any formal training?" Leonard shook his head. "Just pain." Outside the courtroom, pressure was building. Reporters swarmed the steps. The bailiff kept his hand near his holster, not for violence but for control. Inside, Judge Caldwell gripped the sides of his chair. His mind was spinning. How had a man like that, a man who'd once mopped beneath this very bench, cornered him with doctrine he barely remembered? His eyes darted to the court clerk. Get me his background. Full file. Work records. Disciplinary history. The clerk hesitated. He's been here 15 years, Your Honor. Not even a late clock-in. Everyone's got something. Caldwell muttered. I want his. Caldwell wasn't just shaken. He was exposed. The courtroom had always been his stage. Leonard had upstaged him in seconds. Back in chambers, Caldwell poured himself a drink. Not alcohol, just water. But the way his hands trembled, you'd think it was vodka. On his desk was a printout of Leonard's testimony, already transcribed by an intern eager to impress. Caldwell stared at the words. Establish justice. Ensure domestic tranquility. It felt like a taunt now. How had a janitor outmaneuvered a judge? Back in the hallway, Leonard walked slowly, deliberately. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. But people moved for him now. The same bailiff who once refused to buzz him into the staff kitchen now avoided his gaze. Tasha grabbed his arm. What's going to happen next? Leonard didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up at the courthouse ceiling. Intricate, Gothic, white. Depends, he said finally. If truth still means anything to that bench. Just then, a voice cut through the hallway. Recess over. Back to court. Leonard tucked the notebook into his coat, adjusted his frayed collar, and stepped toward the double doors again, not as a janitor, not even as a witness, but as something else entirely. Judge Caldwell slammed the gavel as Leonard entered, but not in anger, in panic. The courtroom was now standing room only, and a journalist had just passed the bailiff a sealed envelope, marked confidential, regarding Judge D. Caldwell. Judge Denton Caldwell had once been praised for his smile. It wasn't warm, it was practiced. At fundraisers and legal banquets, it hung on his face like a badge of tolerance, a symbol of cultivated civility. He was known for giving second chances, for shaking hands with men who mopped his courtroom, and for reminding everyone that he treated all people the same. But now, seated high above the courtroom floor with sweat collecting at the curve of his collar, his smile twitched beneath the weight of something he didn't want to name. Fear. Not of Leonard Hayes as a man, but of what Leonard represented. The janitor had dared to quote Madison and Hamilton with the precision of someone who hadn't merely memorized them, but internalized them, and that was the part Caldwell couldn't digest. This wasn't some stunt, this was understanding, intellectual ownership, and in Caldwell's world, shaped by legacy admissions and exclusive memberships, black men could be many things, but they couldn't be smarter than him. His fingers tapped against his bench rhythmically as he replayed Leonard's testimony. Every word, every phrase, each citation, the cadence of control, it unnerved him. His mind wandered backward. Cambridge, 9. Back then, Caldwell had worn tailored wool blazers and talked about meritocracy with a straight face. He remembered the hallway outside the moot court auditorium. A black student, Eli Thomas, was pacing nervously, reciting his oral argument. Caldwell had overheard him mispronounce substantive. He never forgot what he did next. He'd waited until Eli entered the room. Then, when it was his turn to speak, Caldwell had used that very word, substantive, 5 times in one paragraph. Over-articulated, emphasized, deliberately pointed. The class had laughed. Eli flushed. The professor didn't intervene. Caldwell had smiled, charmingly, and said, just trying to keep the standards high. That was how you won. Not by arguing better, by reminding people who belonged. And now, in his courtroom, a man who should have been sweeping the aisle had done to him what he once did to others. Without cruelty, without showmanship, just truth. And it unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. He leaned back and pressed the intercom button near his seat. The static crackled. Get me Officer Daly, he whispered. Within moments, the door to his chambers opened, and a large white man in uniform entered, the bailiff who had laughed when Leonard was introduced earlier. You wanted me, sir. Caldwell didn't turn around. I want everything on him. Leonard Hayes. Pull records, sealed or not. Juvenile, civil, I don't care. Daly hesitated. He's been here for years. Never even took a sick day. There's always something. Caldwell said, eyes fixed on the courtroom door. Find it. Outside, the energy had shifted. The crowd wasn't looking at Caldwell anymore. They were watching Leonard. Reporters whispered to interns. Cameras subtly refocused. Even the stenographer had a slight smile, like history had done something rare. Showed up unannounced. Caldwell returned to the bench, eyes scanning the courtroom. He masked his panic behind a gentle tone. Let's proceed. But beneath the robes his gut churned. He wasn't angry, because Leonard embarrassed him. He was angry because Leonard bypassed every gate that had once made Caldwell feel superior. No degrees, no white mentors, no political donors. Just quiet, relentless intellect, and a lifetime of being underestimated. It wasn't just that Leonard had quoted Hamilton. It was the way he quoted him with familiarity, with reverence, as if he believed in the Constitution more than those paid to uphold it, as if it had belonged to him too. And that thought, it terrified Caldwell. The hearing continued. Riley Gant, energized, walked with a new sense of urgency, motioning to admit Leonard's full written testimony into the court record. Caldwell approved it, but only because the law gave him no grounds not to. His tone was tight, his nod begrudging. Meanwhile, Daly scoured records like a dog with a scent. Back in the judge's private chamber, the clerk's computer glowed. Access to internal judiciary archives required clearance, and Caldwell had that. He wasn't above bending rules when history required it. The search results took seconds. Leonard Hayes, DOB 0311, 1977. Montgomery Youth Detention Center. Case Sun 77, J34112. Charge assaulting a police officer. Sealed at age 7. Caldwell leaned in, jaw stiffening. Bingo! He printed the file with shaking fingers. It wasn't lengthy. The language was typical. Juvenile scuffle. Resisting arrest. But it was enough. Enough to taint. Enough to distract. He picked up the page and whispered to himself, "You don't belong here, Leonard." That phrase, that truth as Caldwell saw it. Leonard was not meant to speak from the stand. He was meant to mop it. But then came the twist. Daly returned with a second file. "Thought you'd want this too," he said, sliding a copy forward. That case, the one he was charged in. Turns out the officer he assaulted was later indicted for planting evidence. Same guy. Whole precinct got shut down. Record was sealed as part of a civil rights payout. Caldwell's hands froze mid-turn. What? Yeah? Hayes never talked about it, apparently. Settled quiet. Whole thing got buried. Caldwell's stomach twisted. That meant if he tried to use this, it might backfire. Leonard's silence wasn't shame. It was strategy. He knew what was in the file. He'd planned for this. The gavel in Caldwell's hand felt heavier than it had minutes ago. Outside, Leonard sat silently, notebook still tucked under one arm. His eyes didn't flinch when the bailiff returned. He met his gaze directly, as if daring him to speak. Caldwell leaned toward the microphone on the bench. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like to ask a few more questions regarding your youth." The courtroom collectively inhaled, but Leonard was already prepared. He stood, face calm, voice ready. "Of course, Your Honor," he said. "Would you like me to recite Gideon V.C. Wainwright first, or should I speak plainly?" Caldwell's hand trembled above the gavel again, but this time the courtroom door opened, and a young intern ran in, holding her phone up. "Judge, someone leaked the sealed file. It's trending nationwide." The courtroom air thickened. Every breath came slower, as if the oxygen had been replaced with anticipation. Phones buzzed across courtroom pews, the energy no longer confined to the wooden walls of Montgomery County Courthouse. It was loose now, feral, cascading through live streams, trending tags, whispers, and headlines. Leonard Hayes stood beneath the flickering lights like a man immune to time. Judge Denton Caldwell's face had paled. In the judge's chambers, the sealed juvenile file, now leaked, glowed on the intern's phone screen. Leonard was 15, had begun to trend. And for the first time in his life, Caldwell tasted exposure. Not the media kind. The moral kind. Leonard didn't look at the phones or the growing crowd outside the windows. He kept his eyes on the judge, steady and unshaken. "You wanted to talk about my past, Your Honor," Leonard said, unfolding a second, larger document from his coat pocket. "Good, let's talk." The courtroom didn't move. Leonard placed the worn document on the evidence table. His original juvenile court file, annotations scribbled in the margins, highlighted passages, newspaper clippings, glued like a scrapbook of buried pain. No lawyer had prepped this. No activist had crafted it. Leonard had kept this record for 32 years, not as a keepsake, as armor. "I was 15, he began. It was November 18. The date hung like a noose in the air. I was walking home from school when I heard shouting outside our apartment. My sister April, she was 13 then, was being thrown against the kitchen wall by 2 officers. No warrant, no knock, just steel and volume. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from remembering. They said they were looking for drugs. We never had drugs. We had roaches, yes. Food stamps, yes. But never drugs. When I stepped between the officer and my sister, he pulled his baton. I swung back. A long silence. That swing cost me 18 months in juvenile detention. Someone in the gallery gasped. Judge Caldwell didn't flinch, but his fingers curled around the base of his gavel like it could shield him from history. Leonard continued, turning a page. Page 3. Your Honor. That's the sentencing order. Signed by Judge Martin Caldwell. Caldwell blinked. My uncle. Leonard nodded. Your blood put me in chains. A tidal wave of emotion swept the courtroom. The room shifted, not physically, but morally. Everything that had once felt hierarchical now felt intimate and damning. Judge Caldwell leaned forward. You're implying something. I'm stating it, Leonard said. Judge Caldwell Sr. sentenced me to 18 months in a privately contracted juvenile facility, later sued for human rights violations. I spent 61 days in solitary confinement. My crime wasn't assault, it was reading. A reporter stood unconsciously. Reading what? Leonard turned to the gallery. A tattered copy of Seize the Time by Bobby Seale. They found it in my bunk. Said it was gang propaganda. His voice hardened. They locked me in a 4x8 cell. No windows. No clocks. One light bulb, turned on and off at random hours. You learn to count time by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Someone sobbed in the back. Leonard didn't look to see who. I wasn't angry then, he said. Not yet. I was confused. I kept thinking justice was late. That maybe it would show up the next morning. Or the next. His hands shook as he turned to the final page. But justice wasn't late. It was never coming. Not for me. Not for my brother. Not for anyone who looked like us. He slid the annotated record forward. These aren't just papers. This is the ghost file. The one no one's supposed to see. But I kept it. Not to remind myself of where I've been, but to make sure no one rewrites where I came from. Caldwell's voice was brittle. Why now? Why bring this up today? Leonard's eyes were fire and stillness all at once. Because you tried to use it against me. But you didn't write my past. I did. And today I'm submitting it into the court record. He turned to Riley Gant. Motion to admit as defense exhibit? Riley nodded, still stunned. Motion granted. I mean yes. Submitted. The court clerk took the document with trembling fingers. Caldwell gripped his bench. This wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was a reversal. The courtroom was no longer a fortress of exclusion. It had become a stage for truth, and Caldwell, for the first time, was not the scriptwriter. Leonard stood silent again, his breath even. The courtroom no longer saw him as the janitor. They saw the chains, the fire, the boy once buried under bureaucracy and racism, who refused to stay buried. Even the walls felt different, because now it was clear. Racism didn't exist only in slurs or bias. It existed in the lineage of benches passed down like heirlooms, in judges whose bloodlines wrote sentences in the ink of assumptions, in how records stayed sealed for the powerful but defined the powerless. Your Honor, Leonard said finally, I didn't come here to ruin you. I came to survive you. A reporter wept openly. And yet, Leonard wasn't finished. He turned back to the judge, and slowly, respectfully but with absolute clarity, spoke a line that seemed to tilt the world sideways. Your uncle gave me a number. Your courtroom tried to erase my name. But today, I remind this court that buried seeds still grow. And then almost casually he reached into his coat and pulled out a second, smaller folder. Your Honor, he said, this file includes 6 other juvenile cases your uncle sentenced within the same month. All black minors. All given maximum terms. None had legal counsel present. Caldwell paled. Would you like to recuse yourself now, or wait until the press asks why? Before Caldwell could respond, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, revealing a tall, suited man with a U.S. Department of Justice badge and a subpoena with the judge's name on it. By the time Leonard Hayes returned to his seat in the courtroom, his words had already escaped the walls. No gag order could stop it. No bench ruling could contain it. The truth cracked open like an egg and spilled raw onto the floor, was now in the bloodstream of the internet, and it was moving fast. It started with an audio clip, shaky and clipped at the edges. A freelance reporter in the back row, uncertain if the story was even worth capturing, had kept her mic running beneath her coat. The moment Leonard began quoting the Constitution, her phone buzzed with signal and recorded clarity. We the people. Within 20 minutes of the DOJ agent entering the courtroom, the clip was on Twitter, posted with a single caption: "A janitor just embarrassed a racist judge by quoting the Constitution better than any lawyer in the room. Listen." It blew up in 12. By the time Judge Caldwell composed himself behind the bench, the hashtag Nenard reads had overtaken sports scores, weather, and even the president's latest statement. People weren't just sharing the video. They were reacting, dissecting, resonating, especially black youth. In dorm rooms, bedrooms, gyms, and barbershops, young black voices began mimicking Leonard, not mocking, but mirroring. On TikTok, teens filmed themselves reciting the Parade Mall, with fists over their hearts. Others stitched the video with facts about mass incarceration. A girl in South Memphis declared, "He made the law ours again." The ripple wasn't polite. It was righteous. Inside the courthouse, Caldwell stared at the subpoena on his desk. It was a request for documents, email records, sentencing histories, financial disclosures. The man from the DOJ didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His badge did the talking. His presence did the threatening. Leonard, however, remained poised, even as cameras began lining the windows, even as the courthouse security moved uneasily, their radios crackling with half-formed commands. He had expected backlash, but not this, not love. That was new, that was dangerous in a different way. Caldwell slammed the gavel again, demanding order. This court is not a media circus, but it was too late. History never asked for permission. He leaned toward his clerk, voice hushed and panicked. "We need to strike his testimony. It's prejudicial now. Public opinion is contaminating this hearing." The clerk looked doubtful. "There's no legal ground. He's a sworn witness." "Then fabricate one," Caldwell hissed. He turned to the courtroom. "I'm issuing a motion to exclude all remarks made by Mr. Hayes regarding his juvenile record and constitutional citations. They are inflammatory and outside the scope of material relevance." The courtroom gasped. Riley Gant shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The record is already entered. The testimony was factual and responsive. You can't erase the truth just because it's inconvenient." Caldwell's lips curled. "This isn't a town hall, Miss Gant." "No, sir," she said, eyes narrowing. "It's a court. Which means the rules apply to you too." Leonard's voice entered again, not loud, just enough to shift the air. "The Constitution doesn't ask for your permission to exist. It already includes me." The crowd stirred. A woman in the back stood up, older, gray-haired, cane in hand. "My father was jailed for asking to vote," she said. "He memorized the preamble too. Mr. Hayes reminded me of him." Caldwell barked, "Bailiff, remove her from this courtroom." The bailiff hesitated. Outside, news trucks parked along the sidewalk. Microphones were being prepped. A CNN van had just pulled up beside a growing crowd of protesters holding cardboard signs. "We the people" includes janitors. "Clean the bench. Justice can't be whitewashed." Meanwhile, Leonard remained seated, arms folded, head bowed, not in defeat, but in solemn knowing. He had not asked to go viral, but his silence now resonated louder than speeches. The courtroom had tried to bury his story. Now it was louder than a sermon, larger than law. Back in chambers, Caldwell panicked. He opened his laptop, clicking through emails. Someone had already leaked internal courthouse emails. He'd once referred to defendants as urban liabilities. In a message to a developer, the kind of language that doesn't need translation, just context. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He picked up. A voice, calm, practiced, spoke. "Judge Caldwell, this is Mayor Lynn Shaw. We're requesting a formal review of your judicial conduct, effective immediately." Caldwell's voice cracked. "You can't, this isn't. This is now. You'll receive written notice. I suggest you finish this hearing quietly." The line cut. He stared at the black screen as if it had betrayed him. Back in the courtroom, the mayor's email began circulating among city officials. Within minutes, it was posted on the county's official page. It was written in careful legalese, but boiled down to one truth. Caldwell's bench was no longer safe. The gallery buzzed with renewed energy. Riley leaned toward Leonard, whispering, You did this. You changed the room. Leonard shook his head. I didn't change it, he said. I just made it tell the truth. And then, like thunder behind velvet, the main doors to the courtroom burst open. The mayor herself stepped inside, dressed in deep blue, face unreadable. She walked straight to the bailiff and handed him a sealed envelope. This is an administrative order. Caldwell rose, voice trembling. You can't walk in here unannounced. She turned to him, voice flat and firm. This building belongs to the people. And so does the law. You've spent years forgetting that. She turned to Leonard. Mr. Hayes, the city is requesting your presence in a public forum tomorrow. We'd like you to speak on constitutional literacy. Leonard blinked, caught off guard for the first time all day. The courtroom erupted into stunned applause. Not loud, not disrespectful, just human, just alive. Caldwell stood frozen, shoulders sagging beneath his robe. His courtroom was no longer his. As cameras flashed and murmurs swelled, Caldwell's phone buzzed one last time. A private message with no name. Just 3 words. We found everything. For the first time in his life, Leonard Hayes woke up to the sound of camera shutters instead of his alarm clock. The sunlight leaking through the blinds was interrupted by silhouettes. Reporters standing on his lawn, their lenses pointed like weapons of curiosity. The day after his courtroom stand, Leonard's name had become a national chant. Talk shows dissected every sentence he uttered. Political pundits scrambled to fit him into their agendas. Was he a symbol of grassroots reform? A threat to institutional stability? A hero or a nuisance? Leonard chose silence. He didn't answer the knocks. He didn't respond to interview requests. While the world built headlines, Leonard built purpose. That morning, he visited the local recreation center on Pierce Avenue, a modest brick building with broken vending machines and paint-chipped walls. Inside, a group of 10 teenagers waited around a folding table, some still yawning, others half curious. Leonard carried nothing but a stack of pocket constitutions. This is the real shield, he said, placing one down in front of each young face. Learn this, and the world loses one excuse to ignore you. The teens looked at him as if he were both preacher and rebel. He was. That first session was awkward. He stumbled. They joked. One kid asked if he had superpowers. Leonard replied without smiling, understanding your rights is the closest thing we've got. And they listened. By the 3rd visit, the room was full. By the end of the week, a local journalist who'd once dismissed Leonard as just a janitor with delusions of activism ran a cover story. The headline read, Custodian of the Constitution, How One Man is Teaching the Law from the Ground Up. The photo beneath the headline showed Leonard leaning over a plastic table, pointing to the 14th Amendment, while a girl with cornrows nodded fiercely. The story went viral again. This time, it wasn't just black youth responding. Civil rights groups reached out. Universities offered honorary lectureships. A prestigious law school even offered him an honorary JD. A token Leonard declined with a short letter. You can't award what I already earned with pain. But not everyone applauded. As the praise grew, so did the fear. Anonymous messages appeared in Leonard's inbox. Stay in your lane. We know where you live. Don't get too smart. He ignored the first few, but then came the tire slashing. He had gone out early one morning to pick up a bulk box of pocket constitutions, donated by a nonprofit, when he saw the gouges on all 4 tires of his truck. Red spray paint marked the sidewalk. Constitution ain't yours. That day, Leonard didn't show up to the rec center. Word traveled fast. Students texted him non-stop, worried. When he finally returned, he walked into a silence thicker than usual. You good, Mr. Hayes? Asked one teen, eyes down. Leonard nodded. I'm still standing. But he didn't mention the cameras now parked near his mailbox, or the local precinct's refusal to file a hate crime report, or the email he received from a white supremacist forum calling him the threat of educated Black America. The subtext was clear. America wasn't scared of Leonard because he mopped floors. It was scared because he had dared to stand above the bench and recite the words they claimed to own. He represented something they couldn't sanitize. Truth in an unapproved package. Late one night, Leonard sat at his kitchen table, notebook open, hands hovering above a blank page. He wasn't writing legal phrases. He was writing letters to his niece, to the kids at the rec center, to his brother's grave. Each one ended with a single line. They thought I was stupid. That was their first mistake. But the pressure didn't stop. One evening, after a particularly moving session on due process, He walked out of the rec center to flashing red and blue lights. 2 officers approached, calm, cold. Leonard Hayes. He stood still. Yes? You're under arrest for obstruction of justice. You need to come with us. A student inside peeked through the window. What's happening? Leonard raised one hand gently. It's all right. The officers cuffed him without force, but not without spectacle. The cameras caught it all. Flashes popped. One reporter yelled, "Why are you arresting a constitutional teacher?" The officer didn't respond, just guided Leonard into the cruiser, like a man who knew this wasn't about legality. It was about message. In the back of the car, Leonard looked out the window as the city blurred past, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it. Not fear.
Rage.
Because he knew what this was. A system correcting its error, trying to put him back in a place where his knowledge couldn't be contagious. The cruiser turned the corner toward the county jail, and Leonard whispered under his breath, "You can jail the man." But not the words. As the squad car pulled into the holding bay, a uniformed officer at intake frowned at the arrest order. His eyes widened when he read who had authorized it, and muttered, "This came straight from Judge Caldwell himself. Here is the full cinematic script for heading." The fluorescent lights of Montgomery County Jail didn't hum. They buzzed like angry insects, filling the intake corridor with a static that seemed to vibrate under the skin. Leonard Hayes stood still beneath that flickering haze, arms cuffed, heart slow, eyes sharp. He wasn't afraid of jail. He was afraid of déjà vu. "Name," barked the booking officer. "Leonard Hayes." The officer looked up from the screen, then down again. His tone shifted. "You're the one from the news." Leonard didn't respond. He'd been here before, not in this facility, not in this era, but in this feeling. The moment when the world makes your dignity a burden, and your brilliance a threat. His wrists ached, not from the cuffs but from the memory they summoned. And then he saw it. The placard on the intake door. In memory of Malcolm J. Hayes. His brother's name. Leonard's knees nearly buckled. They had brought him to the same facility where Malcolm died. They hadn't just arrested him. They had chosen this place. 30 years collapsed in an instant. The pain was too precise to be coincidence. He saw his brother's smile again. The bunk where Malcolm was found. The report that claimed it was suicide. The bruises that said otherwise. As the cell door slid shut behind him, Leonard pressed his back to the wall. Cold concrete. Warm rain. Outside, news outlets flooded the airwaves. The official charge: obstruction of justice and impersonating legal counsel during a court proceeding. The wording was strategic. Vague enough to be legal. Sharp enough to shame. The implication: Leonard, the janitor who quoted the Constitution, had overstepped. Inside the jail, Leonard sat on the lower bunk, notebook gone, rights revoked, dignity bruised, but not broken. And then, the unexpected knock. Hours later, the cell opened. A young black woman entered, mid-30s, tight curls pulled back, briefcase in one hand, determination in the other. "Leonard Hayes?" He nodded slowly. She stepped forward, hand extended. "Amira Fields, I'm your new attorney. Pro bono." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Who sent you?" She gave a small smile. "The Constitution." He chuckled softly, first time in days. Amira was different. Educated in Chicago, molded in fire. She'd passed the bar with top scores, but struggled to find a firm willing to let her lead. She had finally earned a clerkship, and then a courthouse appointment, one Judge Caldwell had helped secure, which made her presence now complicated. They sat on opposite sides of a metal table, chained to expectation. "You know who's behind this," Leonard said. "I do," she answered. "And I also know this isn't just about you. It's about precedent." Leonard tilted his head. "Then you're risking more than you need to." Amira took a breath. "Every time I walked into his courtroom, Caldwell called me young lady, instead of counselor. He once asked if I had ever cleaned a cell before practicing law." Leonard's expression darkened. "So why did you take the job?" She looked away for a beat. "Because I thought I could change it from inside." Then she leaned forward. "But you actually did." Their eyes met, and for a moment, generations merged. A man shaped by janitorial hours. A woman shaped by glass ceilings. Both products of a system that made survival feel like rebellion. Amira opened her briefcase. "I pulled the full case file. It's thin. They rushed it. No real evidence. But it's enough to make you look guilty if no one fights back." Leonard said nothing. "I'm going to fight," she added. Silence again. Then, Leonard nodded. Then we fight. The next day, Amira walked into the Montgomery clerk's office, demanding discovery documents. The receptionist hesitated until Amira flashed her badge. What are you looking for? The clerk asked, trying to stall. Amira didn't blink. Any amended rulings from Caldwell's chambers over the past 3 years, especially those unsigned or retroactively altered. The clerk hesitated, eyes darting. You might want to talk to records, she said quickly. Amira knew that move. They were hiding something. Back in the courthouse archive, she met a junior records analyst who seemed nervous. She was a white woman, mid-20s, hair in a messy bun, and hands twitching. You're looking into Caldwell? She asked quietly. Amira nodded. Yes. You know something? The woman glanced at the security camera, then slid a folder across the counter. Don't tell anyone where you got this. Inside the folder, 3 judicial rulings, altered after they had been filed. Timestamps didn't match. Signatures were inconsistently placed. And in one state, Vorti Daniels, Caldwell had reversed a jury's recommended sentence after private correspondence with a private prison contractor. Amira's stomach turned. This wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. She sat in her car, files open, fingers trembling. Caldwell hadn't just tried to bury Leonard. He'd buried others. And now the soil was loosening. Back at the jail, Leonard sat in the visitor's booth. As Amira slid the documents under the glass, he read them slowly, lips tight. I knew it, he said. I just never had proof. Amira's voice shook slightly. Well, now we do. Leonard looked up. You sure you want to take this road? Amira leaned in. I was born on it. Just as Amira packed her files to leave, her phone buzzed. An anonymous text, no number, just 5 chilling words. You're being watched. Stop digging. The courtroom was colder than usual, not by temperature but by tone. Everything about the space had shifted. The walls seemed to lean inward. The lights flickered slower. Even the floorboards underfoot seemed to hold their breath. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a collision, not just of laws and arguments, but of history, memory, and revenge, cloaked in procedure. Leonard Hayes walked in quietly, shoulders steady, wearing the same blue shirt he'd been arrested in. Amira Fields followed behind, a stack of documents clutched to her chest like armor. Her heels clicked with purpose. Judge Denton Caldwell was already seated, robe pristine, eyes blank. He stared at them with a stillness that bordered on eerie. Amira cleared her throat. Your Honor, before proceedings begin, I am formally requesting that you recuse yourself from this trial on the grounds of conflict of interest and demonstrated racial bias. The courtroom didn't gasp. It held its breath. Caldwell tilted his head slightly. Miss Fields, you're aware that such motions require substantiated cause, not just personal discomfort. Amira didn't flinch. I have filed an affidavit outlining multiple instances where Your Honor has ruled inconsistently in racially charged cases, altered jury instructions, and shown verbal contempt for defendants based on race. Caldwell chuckled softly. Counselor, if this is your strategy, accuse the referee before the game starts. You're more transparent than I gave you credit for. Leonard said nothing. He didn't have to. His silence was a signal, a stance. It made the judge itch. Amira stepped forward. For the record, I am also submitting audio evidence, obtained from courthouse surveillance archives, time-stamped 2 weeks prior to Mr. Hayes' testimony. In the recording, Your Honor is overheard telling Officer Daly, some people should stick to mopping floors. Gasps erupted. Even the court clerk stiffened. Caldwell's lips parted, then closed again. That statement, Amira continued, was made in reference to Mr. Hayes. Caldwell banged the gavel. Order. But the sound didn't carry the usual weight. It cracked slightly, like wood under strain. Leonard kept his eyes forward, chin level. 1,000 courtroom nights had taught him how to look at a man and not blink first. This motion is denied. Caldwell snapped. There is no formal misconduct ruling against me. The trial proceeds. Amira nodded slowly, already expecting the response. She turned to Leonard. Then we proceed on our own terms. The hearing began. The prosecution moved quickly, relying on shallow testimony, procedural complaints, and rhetorical misdirection. Their central argument, Leonard Hayes misrepresented his legal standing, interfered with a judicial process, and publicly embarrassed the bench in a way that constituted contempt. Amira countered with precision. No law prevents a citizen from quoting the Constitution in court, she said. There is no statute that bars a witness from speaking truth. This isn't a trial, it's a vendetta in a black robe. The room froze. Caldwell's cheeks reddened slightly. His fingers fumbled over his water glass. A tremor ran through his right hand. It wasn't age, it was exposure. But the metaphor rising in the room was clearer than anything said aloud. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a boxing ring. Leonard stood like a quiet fighter in the corner, arms metaphorically raised, waiting. His silence was his footwork, every breath measured, every blink a dodge. Caldwell, for all his power, looked less like a judge, and more like a desperate man trying not to be unseated. Amira moved in with her next jab. She submitted a new deposition from a former judicial assistant who claimed Caldwell regularly referred to black defendants as low cognitive in private notes. The judge's face twitched as he recognized the name. She had worked under him for 6 years. The room buzzed again. And then the twist. From the back of the courtroom, a man in a blue suit stood up. He walked slowly to the bailiff, handed him an envelope, and whispered something. The bailiff's eyebrows rose. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, you're requested to pause proceedings. There's a representative from the State Judicial Ethics Board in chambers." Caldwell's mask cracked. "What?" he snapped. The man in the blue suit stepped forward. "Your Honor, my name is Jason Kravitz. I represent the Office of Judicial Oversight. We've received multiple complaints and corroborating evidence of misconduct. We're here to review the matter. Immediately." "You can't, this is my courtroom," Caldwell growled. Kravitz didn't blink. "Exactly." Amira turned slowly toward Caldwell, her voice soft but lethal. "Still think you're the referee?" Caldwell looked at Leonard, then really looked. For a split second, the judge saw not a janitor, not an adversary, but a mirror, a man who had never been granted permission to enter the ring, and still landed a blow. "Court is recessed," Caldwell muttered. But the gavel didn't drop. It hovered. As the ethics board led Caldwell into chambers, a court officer stepped into the hallway and found Amira, handing her a flash drive labeled only Camera 3 the night Leonard was arrested. The jail's visitation booth was silent, but Leonard Hayes and Amira Fields didn't need volume to make history. Between them, the thick glass blurred nothing. Their strategy passed through the receiver like code. Tight, hushed, low. Leonard leaned forward, voice even. "They never expected me to survive the first trial. Not emotionally, not institutionally. They hoped the system would bury me before I could ever speak back." Amira nodded slowly, face tight. "Then let's make sure this time, you're not just speaking, you're broadcasting." They had a plan. And it started with unearthing stories the world had forgotten. That night, Amira worked late, scrolling through court transcripts from Caldwell's decade on the bench. She cross-referenced names of black defendants, tagging each with keywords: harsh sentencing, mistrial denial, jury instruction override. What emerged wasn't subtle. It was a map of abuse, each point a quiet injustice, stitched together by a single hand. Caldwell's. But Leonard had a deeper memory than the files could show. "They never listened," he said, eyes hollow as he sat on his cot. You could have a mother weeping on the stand, a child speaking truth. Didn't matter. The moment your skin crossed the threshold, they'd already decided. Amira decided to give voice to the silenced. She hired a documentary editor, quietly, anonymously, to cut together a visual montage of courtroom footage, available through public access laws. One clip showed a teen boy shaking, as Caldwell called him a ticking time bomb. Another showed a young woman denied bail for stealing diapers. Each face looked eerily familiar. Leonard watched the first cut in the jail's legal room. No sound. Just images. Just faces. All black. All dismissed. He murmured, "This is what they fear. Not noise. Memory." Amira's resolve deepened. But while Leonard planned from a cell, Amira's past tapped on her shoulder. One night, after logging case documents, she found herself staring at a photo on her desk. Her brother, Kareem, grinning, diploma in hand, right before it was stripped from him. Flashback. Kareem Fields had been a rising junior, the first black engineering student to lead a robotics team at Westridge Tech. 1 month before finals, he was accused of plagiarism by a white professor who refused to show the evidence. The hearing was private, rushed. He was expelled within a week. Amira had watched it happen, watched the toll it took. Kareem never went back to school, never trusted systems again. He now worked in a warehouse, brilliant, wasted. That memory returned now, not as grief, but as fire. Back in the courthouse, Amira took a risk. She met with Tamara Wells, a former court clerk who had quietly resigned after a controversial case. Caldwell presided over a capital trial, State v. Latrell Jenkins. The defendant, a black man with no prior record, was convicted and sentenced to death after Caldwell intervened in jury deliberations, allegedly clarifying instructions. The man's lawyer never saw the new language. Tamara had stayed quiet. She had a mortgage, 2 kids, and a husband on parole. But when Amira showed her the leaked footage of Leonard quoting the Constitution, something cracked in her. "I was just trying to keep my job," she whispered. "But I watched that man make decisions like he was choosing appetizers." "Tamara," Amira said gently, "will you testify?" Tamara shook her head. "They'll come for me. They're already coming," Amira replied. "But if you speak, you won't be alone." 3 days later, Tamara gave a recorded deposition. She laid it bare. The altered jury instructions. The pressure Caldwell placed on junior staff. The comments he made about cleaning up the neighborhood. Amira filed a formal motion with the State Judicial Review Board. Leonard Hayes v. the people of Montgomery County. She also emailed every civil rights watchdog she could find. Within 24 hours, national media picked it up. Whistleblower claims judge tampered with death penalty case. Pattern of racial bias in Montgomery court uncovered. Inside the jail, Leonard finally smiled. But then came the twist. Amira received an email from the state court scheduler. A new trial had been approved to review Leonard's charges in a higher court. Relief washed over her until she read the final line. Presiding Judge, the Honorable Denton Caldwell. Amira stared at the screen, jaw clenched. She stormed into the jail. Leonard saw her expression before she spoke. "They're giving him the case again," she said. Leonard let the silence sink. "Of course they are. This is sabotage. It's tradition," he replied. "Racism, with a robe on." But then he looked up. "And we won't let it stand." They crafted a new strategy. Public exposure. If they couldn't remove Caldwell by law, they would remove him by spotlight. They leaked the deposition. Tamara's voice trembling. Raw, human. They sent out legal analysis. They flooded public defenders' inboxes. Students at Westridge Law began holding campus rallies. The pressure returned, calls to Amira's phone, threats, silence from allies. But one night, while walking to her car, a man approached her in the parking garage. Black, older, soft voice. "You're the one helping Mr. Hayes?" She nodded. Uneasy. The man pulled a crumpled paper from his coat. "My son was sentenced by Caldwell, too. No lawyer, just warnings." He handed her a case number, then walked away. She added it to the growing list. Back at the jail, Leonard lay awake staring at the ceiling. The cell was dark, but his mind was lit with memory. His brother's cell, the judge's voice, the bailiff's smirk. It all played back like a warped film reel. But now he wasn't alone. The fight had left the shadows. The system had tried to bury Leonard under paperwork, prejudice, and silence. But it underestimated one thing. He'd learned how to dig. As Amira printed the new batch of evidence, her phone buzzed with a restricted number. She picked up and a disguised voice said, "If you walk into court Monday, you won't walk out." The courtroom was packed beyond fire code. Even the aisles were full. Law students seated on the floor, retired judges on the back row, and a quiet cluster of high schoolers from Pierce Avenue Academy, wearing homemade t-shirts that read, "We the People." Everyone had come for one reason. Leonard Hayes was about to speak again. After days of testimony, leaks, subpoenas, and a public spotlight that scorched the very walls of Montgomery County Courthouse, it had come down to this: Leonard's final words on the stand. The bailiff called his name, and the murmurs stopped like someone had unplugged the room. Leonard walked slowly, his palms damp, a folded paper tucked neatly in the inner pocket of his shirt. He moved like a man walking through history, knowing each step would echo far beyond that polished floor. As he sat and raised his right hand, the bailiff began the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you." Leonard interrupted. "No disrespect," he said gently, "but I don't swear to men. I swear to justice." The courtroom froze. Judge Caldwell, still seated, but increasingly sidelined by state investigators, didn't object. Leonard adjusted the mic. "I never thought I'd be back up here," he began, voice thin but steady. "Not after what happened. Not after how I was taken out of here last time. Not after I was dragged through the system for the crime of knowing too much." His eyes scanned the room, not with accusation but presence. I spent years cleaning these floors, listening to people talk about justice like it was a chess game, like the right to dignity was something earned by the hour. I kept quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I thought the law would speak for me. One day. He paused, breathing deeply. But that day never came. So I started reading. The audience leaned in. I read cases, rulings, amendments. I read until the words stopped being abstract, until they became personal, until the Constitution didn't feel like something written for someone else. He pulled the folded page from his pocket and held it carefully, like a relic. I brought this with me not because it's my defense, but because it's my belonging. He opened the page, yellowed, edges torn. This was my brother's. He underlined a line from Frederick Douglass and circled it so hard the paper almost ripped. It says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Leonard looked up, directly at the jury. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm demanding acknowledgement. Not just for myself, but for every black boy who ever sat in a courtroom and wondered if anyone saw him as human. For every janitor who's been called boy in a hallway. For every voice ignored because it didn't wear a tie or carry a briefcase." He folded the paper again and placed it gently on the table. "Do you know what it feels like to be smart and invisible at the same time?" The room went still. To walk into a room and know more than half the people there, but still be called just the help. To know the law better than the man holding the gavel, but be told your knowledge isn't valid because you didn't pay for it in a classroom. He looked at the prosecution. "And yet I came anyway. Not to disrupt, but to remind." He turned back to the jury. "I am not your defendant. I am your mirror." Gasps. Audible now. Even the court stenographer paused mid-keystroke, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. Leonard's voice lowered. "I remember reading something Angela Davis once said. She said, 'I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept.'" He let the weight of that sit in the air. "I don't accept that justice belongs only to those who can afford it. I don't accept that knowledge only counts when it's printed on parchment and handed out by deans. I don't accept that being quiet equals being safe." He looked at the judge now. "I don't accept that this bench belongs only to men who inherited it." The crowd was silent, but trembling. "I am Leonard Hayes," he said, louder now. "I was once a janitor, in this building. I am still a student of law. I am still a believer in the Constitution. Not the version that's twisted for convenience, but the one written for every person, including me." He paused. "I am the people." Then, gently, almost reverently, he recited the last words from memory. "And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America."
The silence after was seismic.
No applause. No coughs. No shifting. Just awe. Then from the bench, the faint sound of movement. Judge Caldwell reached slowly for his gavel. Leonard didn't move. He stared straight ahead, unblinking. One clean drop. The gavel struck the bench once. Not loud, not aggressive, just final. As the gavel echoed, an official from the ethics board rose and said, "Before we proceed with verdicts, there's new evidence tied to the arrest footage." A USB was placed on the court's AV console. The courtroom had gone from air-conditioned to sacred. You could feel it in the stillness, the kind that happens when truth stops being theoretical and becomes personal. Leonard Hayes remained seated at the defense table, his hands calmly folded, eyes resting somewhere just above the jury box. Amira sat beside him, motionless but vibrating inside. Every breath they took felt like the next page of history waiting to be written. At the front, Judge Caldwell wore a look that straddled two worlds, one of denial, the other of dawning consequence. Behind him, the courtroom monitor still displayed the final frame of the footage. His voice caught on a grainy audio clip, saying, "Make an example of him," as Leonard was wrongly arrested. The jury returned. 12 faces. Different races. No words. In the case of the state versus Leonard Hayes, we the jury find the defendant not guilty on all counts. Cheers tried to erupt, but Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel. "This is a court of law." He could barely get the sentence out. His voice faltered beneath the weight of its own hypocrisy. Amira turned to Leonard. "It's done." Leonard didn't cry. He didn't smile. He exhaled, like a man who had finally reached the surface after being held underwater for years. But outside the courthouse, The sound was anything but muted. The crowd erupted. Hundreds, maybe more, lined the courthouse steps. They shouted, clapped, chanted, "Leonard! Leonard! Leonard!" Phones shot video, reporters went live, and somewhere in thousands of homes, young black boys and girls sat on their living room floors, watching a man who once cleaned floors now reshape the meaning of them. A man who had started with a mop and a worn copy of the Constitution had now stood on principle against a judge, an institution, and a city. Inside, as Leonard stood to leave, the bailiff, white, older, usually indifferent, opened the gate for him and whispered, "Sir." Just that. "Sir." The courtroom doors opened, and Leonard stepped into daylight, not as a defendant, not even just as a man, but as a metaphor, from janitor to justice warrior. And yet the victory wasn't complete. As Amira and Leonard descended the courthouse steps, fielding questions, flashbulbs, and an avalanche of emotion, a journalist's voice cut through the noise. "Judge Caldwell remains on the bench. What's your response to that?" Leonard paused. "I never wanted to replace him," he said. "I wanted the truth to replace silence." It was a diplomat's answer, but his eyes betrayed the ache. The unfinished business. Caldwell, though disgraced, still held his gavel. The ethics board had not yet ruled. The mayor's office, fearful of stirring civil unrest, was awaiting due process. The legal system had cleared Leonard, but had not yet cleansed itself. And the city? Divided. Black communities threw barbecues. Kids rewrote rap verses with his name in the hook. Churches rang bells. Local artists painted murals of Leonard standing in front of a courthouse, mop in one hand, Constitution in the other. But the other side? Fury. The city's elite gathered in private homes and whisper-heavy boardrooms, calling the case a theatrical distraction. Online forums filled with dog whistles and open disdain. Donations to local justice preservation groups surged, coded language familiar to anyone who had studied the patterns. Even Caldwell's supporters began circulating a theory that Leonard had help, that the video was staged, that Amira was radicalized. It was the same playbook. Doubt the win, devalue the warrior. But Leonard didn't flinch. He didn't show up on talk shows. He didn't sign any book deals. He returned quietly to his modest home on Tuckman Avenue, where the porch light flickered, and the screen door always creaked.
That night he sat alone at his kitchen table, with a cup of black coffee and no sugar.
Outside, the voices of celebration still floated through the air. But inside, Leonard just sat in the quiet, hands pressed flat against the wood grain, absorbing everything, and nothing, until the knock came. It was soft, almost polite. He opened the door slowly. No one was there, just a manila envelope, on the mat, unmarked. He looked down at it like a relic. No return address. No writing. Just wait. Inside, a single sheet of paper and a USB drive. The paper read only this: "The bench has more cracks than you think. Start with file 6. Caldwell wasn't alone. His fingers tensed around the page. His stomach turned, not in fear, but in recognition. This wasn't over. The system hadn't just tried to silence him. It had networked its silence, layered it in procedural camouflage, spread it through courtrooms, contracts, and quiet vendettas. And someone else had been watching. Someone from within. As Leonard plugged the USB into his laptop, the first file opened with courtroom footage from 2003, showing Judge Caldwell shaking hands in private with a man now running for state attorney general. The video on Leonard's laptop played grainy at first, a dusty clip from 2003, but the sound was crisp enough to cut through time. "Congratulations, Denton," said a low voice. Caldwell, 20 years younger, leaned in to shake hands with a man in a dark trench coat. A second later, the camera zoomed slightly, catching a passing comment: "Montgomery Heights will be yours. You clear the docket, we'll clear the lots." Leonard paused the video. Montgomery Heights. A name sewn into pain for dozens of black families forced out by court orders. It had always been whispered: evictions justified by unpaid code violations. Properties flipped overnight by corporations connected to backroom politicians. It was one of the many myths black neighborhoods carried like second skin, that someone powerful was profiting off their displacement. Now it was no longer myth. The files on the USB were meticulous. Spreadsheets cross-referencing addresses, names, and court dates. Eviction notices tied directly to land purchases. Developers' contracts time-stamped days before verdicts were issued. It wasn't sloppy corruption. It was machine-precise. and at the center of it, Judge Denton Caldwell. Leonard didn't call Amira immediately. He stared at the screen for a long time, letting the truth settle into something heavier than rage, vindication soaked in betrayal. When he finally did call, Amira answered on the first ring. "I need you to see something," Leonard said. 30 minutes later, she sat at his kitchen table, flipping through printouts with surgical eyes. Each document darkened her face. "They weaponized the court," she whispered. Leonard nodded. "And they profited." Amira didn't wait. She uploaded select files, redacted to protect identities, to trusted reporters she'd worked with before. No clickbait, no spin, just cold, devastating truth. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Breaking: Judge Caldwell linked to illegal property scheme. Justice for sale: Montgomery's hidden eviction empire. Land, lies and law. What did Judge Caldwell know? It was no longer a local scandal. It was statewide. By noon, the governor held a press conference. Tight-lipped, controlled, but furious beneath the surface. "We have opened a full inquiry into the actions of Judge Denton Caldwell. Effective immediately, he will step down from the bench pending a formal ethics investigation. Any criminal actions discovered will be prosecuted." Leonard watched from home, hands clasped, unmoving. Caldwell's empire, fortified by years of silence, nepotism, and calculated cruelty, was beginning to collapse. But the fall wasn't dramatic. It was eerily quiet.
No statement, no apology, just a single sentence issued by his attorney.
Judge Caldwell resigns from his position and will not be available for comment. No remorse. No reckoning. Just a retreat into the shadows that had once shielded him. But the damage was already done. Within hours of the leak, 38 cases Caldwell presided over were flagged for review. The state judiciary dispatched an emergency team to comb through verdicts, sentence disparities, and jury tampering allegations. The courthouse steps became a gathering place for the forgotten. Black mothers holding eviction notices. Veterans who'd lost homes. College students expelled under suspicious rulings. Families lined up clutching manila folders and fading memories, hoping this time finally their voices would matter. One woman, Miss Renetta, held a framed photo of her son. He was sentenced for possession. First offense. 9 years, she said to a reporter. Judge Caldwell looked at him like he wasn't human. Another man whispered, "He evicted my grandmother while she was on oxygen." Said the paperwork didn't mention her illness. Leonard stood at a distance, watching it unfold. He saw something bigger than himself. This wasn't just the fall of one judge. It was the unraveling of a philosophy, of judicial elitism masked as order, of power unchecked, leveraged quietly, and sold to the highest bidder. That night, Amira returned to Leonard's porch. "They offered you something," she said. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "The governor's office. They want you on the Justice Reform Commission." He was quiet for a long moment.
I didn't do this for a title, he said.
"I know," she replied. "But maybe now you can shape the next courtroom, not just survive it." Leonard looked out at the street. Kids rode bikes past his house. A boy trailing a kite with the words "We the People" painted on it. The sun dipped just below the rooftops, casting gold across the pavement. He remembered mopping floors under flickering lights, quoting amendments to himself like prayer. Now the same system that once tried to erase him wanted his insight. "I'll think about it," he said softly. Amira didn't press. As she left, Leonard returned to his laptop. One file on the USB remained unopened, labeled simply Testimonies, Internal. He clicked. A series of anonymous interviews began to play. Former clerks, junior prosecutors, even a bailiff, each detailing Caldwell's manipulation of cases, his threats, his biases. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. He had constructed a kingdom where his word became fate, and no one had dared to question it. Until now. Just as Leonard closed the laptop, his phone buzzed with a new message. "You've opened one door, but there's another judge. Worse. Look into Judge Maynard." The clock's ticking. Leonard sat on the edge of his bed, fully dressed though the sun hadn't risen yet. The curtains filtered a faint light through their worn edges, casting long, soft shadows across the room. In his lap was a sealed envelope, the formal offer from the governor's office, inviting him to join the Justice Reform Commission. The words inside were crisp and ceremonial. "Your lived experience, civic impact, and demonstrated moral leadership are assets this state needs." He hadn't touched it for 3 days. He glanced at the notebook on his nightstand, the same one that once carried the Constitution's preamble in his father's handwriting. The same notebook he'd read from in that courtroom, hands shaking but voice steady. It sat quietly, worn and dignified. Like him. Leonard's fingers clenched the envelope, then loosened. He leaned back, eyes tracing the cracked ceiling. Memory returned uninvited. He'd walked into Montgomery County Courthouse wearing freshly cleaned overalls, holding a mop with more care than some men held a gavel. The head custodian had barely acknowledged him, handing him a plastic cart with bleach and gloves like it was a burden, not a job. No one looked at him. They looked through him. One lawyer walked past and dropped his coffee cup at Leonard's feet without breaking stride.
A clerk asked, "Can you move faster? This floor isn't going to shine itself."
In the break room, Leonard sat alone, surrounded by laughter that wasn't his. He remembered trying to make eye contact with one of the judges once. The man looked right through him, adjusted his robe, and turned away. That was the day he stopped trying to be seen. Instead, he listened, observed. Now the same halls that had rendered him invisible were echoing his name. He was no longer the janitor in the shadows. He was the man being asked to rewrite the blueprint of the courtroom itself. But the imposter syndrome was persistent. "They only want me now because it's safe," he whispered to himself. Later that morning, Amira arrived. No press, no ceremony, just her in jeans, and a hoodie holding 2 coffee cups. "You're dodging the offer," she said flatly, sitting at his kitchen table. Leonard gave a weak smile. "What if I don't belong there?" She tilted her head. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because I cleaned the floor they want me to sit above. Because I memorized the Constitution from a second-hand book, not a lecture hall. Because you wore overalls instead of robes?" She interrupted. "Leonard, the mop was never your identity. It was your camouflage." He looked up. "The system only respects degrees, not depth," he muttered. Amira leaned forward, her voice low but slicing. "They don't need your degree. They need your truth. No one else could have done what you did. No one else did. You stared down a machine that swallowed people whole. You broke it." She reached into her bag and slid a photo across the table. It was from a protest 2 nights prior. A black boy, no older than 10, standing in front of a mural. On the wall was Leonard's face, mid-speech painted in broad strokes of resistance and hope. In the boy's hand, a pocket constitution. Leonard exhaled, the breath long and fragile. He finally opened the envelope. He accepted the offer, but with conditions. He would serve on the Justice Reform Commission only if the panel included formerly incarcerated citizens, public defenders and grassroots organizers. No stacked deck. No backroom decisions. "If I do this," he told the governor's liaison, "I do it on behalf of the people they pretend don't know the law." The reply came back in less than an hour. "Agreed." The announcement broke that afternoon. The media ran it with poetic flair. From janitor to justice architect, Leonard Hayes joined State Reform Commission. But Leonard didn't care about headlines. He cared about what came next. 2 weeks later, he returned to Montgomery County Courthouse. Not with cleaning supplies, not in silence, but in a tailored gray suit, Constitution notebook tucked inside his jacket like a shield. He stood on the courthouse steps, the very same ones where he was once led away in cuffs. Now cameras faced him voluntarily. Citizens gathered not in protest, but in participation. A wooden podium stood before him, flanked by flags and flanked even more powerfully by mothers, youth, teachers, activists. Amira stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes glistening. Leonard stepped to the mic. He didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a man who had been forced to speak last, and now knew the value of going first. "This courthouse," he began, "once treated me like a broom with a heartbeat. It made me invisible. It tried to mop me up with its rules. But here's what they didn't realize. When you clean something long enough, you learn what's been swept under the rug." The crowd stirred, and what we swept up was more than dust. It was silence, injustice, disregard. He lifted his notebook. "This document doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the persistent, to the poor, to the ones who know its promises have sometimes been lies, but believe in it anyway." He looked out across the crowd. "This isn't about me. It never was. It's about all of us. Janitors, students, clerks, dreamers, finally being allowed to write the next chapter of justice together." The audience erupted, not in applause alone, but in a wave of shared ownership. The moment was not his. It was theirs. After the speech, Leonard didn't linger. He slipped away quietly, walking down the marble steps like he had done 1,000 times before. But this time the weight on his shoulders was purpose, not shame. That evening, a state official arrived at his home. No cameras, no noise, just a folder. Inside it was a nomination letter, sealed with the state seal. Leonard opened it slowly, reading each word twice. He was being formally nominated for the state's highest civilian honor, an award given only to individuals who had redefined civic contribution. It came with a single closing sentence. He was not just a janitor. He was justice in plain clothes. Leonard smiled gently, until he saw the list of past recipients, and one name stood out, circled in red ink: Judge Maynard. The echo of applause had long faded, but Leonard Hayes understood that real change never came with fanfare. It came quietly, in classrooms, in kitchen table conversations, in the flicker of realization in a child's eyes. 3 months after the courthouse speech that made national headlines, Leonard was back in familiar territory, not in a courtroom, not on a podium, in a classroom, a South Montgomery public school, with water-stained ceilings and a cracked chalkboard. It was the first pilot location for his new initiative, the Constitutional Literacy Project. He stood in front of 28 middle schoolers wearing t-shirts that read "I am the Constitution," in bold navy blue. There were no suits in the room, no press, just desks, worn-out textbooks, and a chalk stick that broke in half the moment Leonard picked it up. He laughed. "This piece of chalk is older than most of you," he said. The students giggled, but within moments, the tone shifted. Leonard placed a pocket Constitution on every desk, the same kind he used to carry while sweeping courtroom floors, the same kind he kept in his jacket during his trial, the same one he'd placed gently in front of a jury that thought he didn't belong. "Today," he began, "you learn not how to memorize history but how to recognize your power inside it." He started with the preamble, not by reciting it, but by explaining the intent behind it. When they said "we the people," they didn't mean janitors, or farmers, or folks who looked like me, but they wrote something bigger than themselves. And we inherited it, which means now, it is about us. A boy raised his hand. "What happens if someone powerful breaks the rules?" Leonard smiled. "Then it becomes our job to remind them. Power isn't permission, it's responsibility." Word of the project spread fast. Within 2 weeks, 6 more schools signed up. Within 2 months there was a wait list. Local teachers, civic groups, and even journalists began calling it the most meaningful education initiative since desegregation. And it wasn't just the students who were learning. Parents came to evening sessions. Custodians volunteered. Formerly incarcerated citizens gave testimonials. Judges who had once looked past Leonard now quoted him at symposiums. One former court clerk, Marla Green, released a memoir titled "Broom and Gavel: The Story of Leonard Hayes." It hit bestseller lists within a week. "This isn't about performance," he told Marla. "It's about permanence." And yet, for all the public momentum, Leonard kept one thing sacred. On his most recent visit, Leonard brought with him a miniature Constitution, leather-bound and worn at the edges, the same copy Malcolm once read aloud during their nights at home. Before the raid, before the cuffs, before the silence, he placed it on the headstone, gently. "Your voice made mine possible," he whispered. He didn't cry. Not out of strength, but because he had cried enough for both of them. As he stood to leave, a breeze lifted the first few pages of the Constitution and flapped them like wings. Leonard paused, then smiled. Back in the city, Amira continued helping with policy reforms, her face now known in state legislature circles. Still direct, still dangerous in the best ways. She and Leonard stayed close, not for cameras, not for clout, but because some wars forged something deeper than friendship. They forged survival. One night, as they sat in his kitchen reviewing school expansion proposals, her phone buzzed. She read the message, blinked, and handed it to Leonard. It was a copy of a Supreme Court opinion, one of the year's most anticipated rulings, concerning unlawful policing practices in low-income neighborhoods. The majority opinion cited several sources, but buried in the fourth footnote was something astonishing. See also Testimony of Leonard Hayes, Hayes v. Montgomery County, 2025, wherein the witness articulates a compelling constitutional interpretation rooted in access, not privilege. Leonard stared at the screen. "They cited you," Amira said quietly. "Not in a viral tweet, not in a headline. In law." His voice, once dismissed, now helped to define federal doctrine. And it wasn't just a mention. Legal scholars online had already begun calling it the Hayes footnote. Some believed it would be studied in law schools for years to come. A pivot point where grassroots understanding re-entered constitutional interpretation. Leonard sat back. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. Instead, he reached for his notebook and began to write. Not a memoir. A lesson plan. If the country was going to quote him, he wanted to make sure kids knew why. That night, a school in Atlanta emailed. Then one in Detroit. Then one in Oakland. Within a week, the Constitutional Literacy Project had spread to 37 cities. And still, Leonard never called himself an activist, or a leader, or even a reformer. When asked by a reporter how he preferred to be introduced, he replied, "Just say, a man who used to clean up after the system, and finally made it clean itself." As Leonard finalized expansion plans for rural schools, he received a call from a number he didn't recognize. A voice spoke, "We'd like you to address the United Nations on Education and Dignity, and we've just confirmed, Judge Maynard will be in the audience." January 15th. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The nation was paused, not in silence, but in attention. Families gathered around televisions. Classrooms wheeled in projectors. Community centers overflowed. It wasn't a holiday anymore. It was a reckoning. The White House had extended the invitation 6 weeks prior. They didn't want a celebrity. They didn't want a politician. They wanted a witness. Someone who had seen the system from beneath its robes and dared to demand it answer for itself. They wanted Leonard Hayes. Now standing behind a smooth walnut podium in the Capitol's Freedom Hall, Leonard adjusted the microphone. The room held diplomats, federal judges, educators, clergy, and 2 former presidents. But the most powerful seat in that room remained empty, one designated for the people. Leonard didn't wear a tie. He wore a gray suit and a pin in the shape of a pocket constitution. The lights dimmed, the cameras rolled, and silence settled like sacred cloth. He began. "I want to talk to you today about what justice sounds like. Because for most of my life I knew what it felt like, but I'd never heard it. Not from a courtroom, not from a policy, certainly not from a judge's bench. I had to create it out of silence, out of resilience, and out of the memory of the people they tried to forget." People leaned in. The audio streamed live to 42 countries. Subtitles in 14 languages scrolled across global screens. "They laughed at me once," Leonard continued. "When I stood to speak in court, they didn't laugh because I was wrong. They laughed because I wasn't expected to be right, because I was just a janitor, because I had no degrees, no title, no power, just a mop and a memory." He paused, scanning the room slowly. "But justice isn't what we wear. It's what we withstand." The crowd shifted, some with tears in their eyes, others with hearts slowly breaking open. Justice is not found in marble columns or Latin phrases. It's found in late nights spent reading a secondhand book, in knowing your voice matters before anyone else does, in standing alone when standing together hasn't yet begun. He spoke of his brother, Malcolm, of the first day he was called boy in a courtroom he would later transform, of being arrested for knowing too much, of the teacher who once told him law was a language he'd never speak. Today that language is not just mine, it's my niece's too. A camera panned to the front row. There she was, Tasha Reynolds, once evicted by the system, now enrolled at Columbia Law School, on a full scholarship. She wore a tailored blazer, and tears on her cheeks. Leonard looked at her for a moment and nodded. Just once. The crowd turned to see her. She stood slowly. A quiet ovation began. Respectful. "You see," Leonard said, "we were never asking to be included. We were already there. We were just asking to be seen." The speech reached its emotional crescendo as Leonard lifted his old, worn notebook. "This isn't just paper. This is resistance. This is record. This is the document that refused to die in silence." He placed it gently on the podium. "If you remember anything from today, let it be this. Justice delayed is injustice taught. But truth has a longer shelf life than silence." He stepped back. No music played. No confetti dropped. But in that silence, America listened. And the world. It heard. 2 weeks later, a formal resolution was passed by the Montgomery County Council. Unanimous vote. A marble plaque was installed inside the very courthouse that once tried to erase him. Leonard Hayes Hall of Justice, etched beneath it. He taught us that justice begins not in power, but in the quiet insistence of the unseen. The plaque sat on the wall across from the courtroom where he once quoted the Constitution in oil-polished shoes, where he once stood invisible, where he stood again, rewriting the story. The courthouse floor now gleamed, Not from wax but from truth. Inside, a young black boy wandered through the lobby on a field trip. He looked up at the plaque, then down at the notebook displayed in a glass case. "That's his?" he asked the guide. "Yes," she said. "That's the one he read from." The boy nodded. His teacher watched him linger, silent, hand pressed against the glass. Back in Leonard's home, life had returned to quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, pouring tea into a chipped cup, notebook still beside him. Amira entered, dropping off a package. "No cameras today," she said. Leonard chuckled. "Just how I like it." She placed a copy of Harvard Law Review on the table. A new article titled, "The Hayes Doctrine, When Citizenship Becomes Constitutional Literacy." Leonard shook his head. "They're going to teach my case now?" Amira smiled. "They're going to teach your life." He paused, then flipped the magazine shut. "I didn't want to be remembered," he said softly. "I just wanted them to stop forgetting us." She leaned on the counter. "Well, now they can't." Outside, children rode past his porch on bikes, their backpacks tagged with badges from the Constitutional Literacy Project. One shouted, "Mr. Hayes, I passed the Bill of Rights quiz." Leonard laughed, raised a fist in mock salute. The revolution, he realized, wasn't televised. It was taught, and somewhere in the wings of history. That was enough. Leonard stood once more inside the courthouse, just after closing hours. No crowds.
No flashbulbs.
Just quiet. He walked slowly down the corridor, where he once rolled mop buckets, where he once whispered amendments to empty air. Now those same amendments lived on in 100 classrooms, 1,000 young minds. He stopped in front of the courtroom, stepped inside, bent down, ran his fingers across the floor. The same tile he had scrubbed years ago, and with a voice soft but unbreakable, he said, "They called me a janitor." He stood tall, looking up at the seal of justice above the bench, no longer foreign to him. "But I mopped the floor with injustice." They tried to silence him with cuffs, but he answered with the Constitution. If his story made you feel something, if it reminded you that truth can come from anywhere, don't scroll past. Type yes if you believe justice should speak every language, even the janitor.